Good evening. My name is Michael Sullivan. I was asked to moderate because I know both of our debaters tonight, good folks. Welcome to the death penalty debate sponsored by the Aquinas Center of Theology, a Catholic affiliate of Emory that seeks to transform lives through the search for God's wisdom. A strategic objective of the Aquinas Center is to be recognized as a leader for creating dialogue on contemporary moral issues. And tonight is an example of that willingness to take on a difficult issue of the death penalty. The spirit of tonight's discussion is to engage in a common search for the truth. This is done in the proud tradition of the Dominican order, celebrating 800 years in 2016, of the Disputatio. The goal of a disputatio is to provide informed presentations in good faith to allow for the audience to understand different perspectives and deepen their knowledge of the subject. There is a quotation from Aquinas that I'd like to give you. We must love them both, those whose opinion we share and those whose opinions we reject, for both have labored in the search for truth and both have helped us in the finding of it. I would like to thank the St. Thomas More Society, Catholic Lawyers Group, and the Federalist Society of the Emory School of Law for their assistance on this event. I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight. I'm going to start with the far side, John Malcolm, who is the director of the Heritage Foundation's Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. He oversees the Heritage Foundation's work to increase understanding of the Constitution and the rule of law. John is also the Heritage's Ed Gilbertson and Sherry Lindbergh Gilbertson Senior Legal Fellow. He is an honors graduate from Columbia College and Harvard Law School. He clerked for federal judges in the Northern District of Georgia and on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. From 1990 to 97, John served as an assistant U.S. attorney in Atlanta, where he was assigned to the Fraud and Public Corruption section and was an associate independent counsel in Washington, D.C., where we worked together, where he investigated fraud and abuse at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Next is somebody I think you know, Dr. Phil Thompson, who has been the executive director of the Aquinas Center of Theology at Emory since 2008. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago, a JD from the University of Georgia, and an LLM in health law from DePaul University. His more than 25 articles include the piece, St. Augustine and the Death Penalty. He has written in or been interviewed by the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, Headline News, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Georgia Public Radio. His article, Grappling with Faith and the Death Penalty, in the Wall Street Journal, prompted an inquiry by John to do this debate on the death penalty. So I'd like to begin by asking John to come up and let's get started.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to begin by thanking Phil Thompson for inviting me here today to talk about a topic that generates a lot of passion on both sides, and I very much appreciate the spirit in which we're going to engage in this discussion. In a recent opinion, Judge Alex Kaczynski of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decried the use of lethal injection to carry out executions. He said the following: "Using drugs meant for individuals with medical needs to carry out executions is a misguided effort to mask the brutality of executions by making them look serene and peaceful, like something any one of us might experience in our final moments. But executions are, in fact, nothing like that. They are brutal, savage events, and nothing the state tries to do can mask that reality, nor should it. If we as a society want to carry out executions, we should be willing to face the fact that the state is committing a horrendous brutality on our behalf." Now, while I disagree with Judge Kaczynski about using a drug protocol to carry out an execution, I do agree that it is a very solemn task. And I don't want anything that I say here tonight to detract from the fact that I completely recognize that executing another human being is a sober and grim affair. By the same token, I don't think that we can ignore the brutality of the acts that are perpetrated by those who are facing execution. It's important to take both sides of that equation into account when discussing the propriety of the death penalty. Now, when you think about the death penalty, I want you to think about Kenneth Allen McDuff and Colleen Reed. On December 29, 1991, Kenneth Allen McDuff and an accomplice manhandled 28-year-old Colleen Reed into the back of a car. Colleen screamed, "Not me, not me." But McDuff forced her into the back of the car and tied her hands behind her back. As the accomplice drove to a remote location, McDuff repeatedly struck and raped Colleen in the back seat of the car. Not finished, McDuff lit several cigarettes, puffed them into a cherry glow red, and inserted them into her vagina. Finally, as Colleen pleaded for her life, McDuff killed her by crushing her neck. McDuff would later say that killing a woman's like killing a chicken. They both squawk. McDuff raped, tortured, and murdered at least 9 women, probably many more, in the early 1990s before he was finally executed in 1998. McDuff's torture and slaying of Colleen Reed and numerous other women would be horrific standing alone. But what makes these murders even more tragic is that they were easily preventable. In August 1966, McDuff and an accomplice forced a teenage girl named Edna Sullivan and 2 teenage boys into the trunk of a car. McDuff drove them to a secluded spot, and he immediately killed the 2 boys with gunshot blasts to the head. McDuff and his companion then raped Edna Sullivan, and again, not finished, McDuff tortured her with a soft drink bottle and a broken broom handle before finally crushing her neck, killing her. A jury convicted McDuff, and he was given the death penalty. But in 1972, the United States Supreme Court in Furman versus Georgia invalidated all existing death penalty sentences at the time, including McDuff's. McDuff was released in 1989 because of prison overcrowding, leading to the killing spree that left Colleen Reed and many other women dead. Kenneth Allen McDuff is not unique in terms of murderers being released or escaping and killing again. Now, regardless of your feelings about the death penalty, there are certain things that I think that we can all agree on. We all agree that all defendants in capital cases should have competent and zealous lawyers representing them at all stages of the trial process. I think we can all agree that racism of all kinds in the criminal justice system is wrong and that we should work hard to eliminate it. And we should also recognize that in the past, racism was all too prevalent in our criminal justice system and that it occasionally rears its ugly head even today. Nobody is in favor of racist prosecutors, bad judges, or incompetent defense attorneys. And if problems arise in particular cases, they should be corrected, and often are. The question, though, is whether these problems are so pervasive as to justify doing away with the will of the majority of states and people who favor capital punishment in appropriate circumstances. We should, of course, acknowledge that there are people with profound religious and moral objections to the death penalty. Their views should be respected. Reasonable people can and do disagree about whether we should have a death penalty. But in this country, disputes about appropriate sentencing are normally resolved through the legislative process. Most states, 31 to be precise, still have the death penalty, and 41 federal statutes carry the potential for a death sentence. Additionally, whether it's good policy or bad policy, the death penalty is constitutional. Indeed, there are several references to the death penalty in the Constitution itself. The Fifth Amendment provides that no person shall be held to answer for a capital crime unless indicted by a grand jury. The Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause also provides that a person cannot be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb for the same offense. And the Fifth and 14th Amendments provide that a person may not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Therefore, if due process is provided, that is, if sufficient procedural safeguards exist that are put in place to make sure that a trial is fair, then a person can be deprived of his life under the law. Of course, the Supreme Court of the United States has held that there are certain circumstances in which the death penalty cannot be constitutionally applied, such as when the offense is committed by a minor or by an offender who is substantially mentally impaired. However, the court has held on numerous occasions that the punishment of death for the crime of murder does not, under all circumstances, violate the Constitution, and that one has to consider the nexus between the crime committed and the punishment, not just the nature of the punishment itself, when considering its constitutionality. The death penalty is still favored by a solid majority of Americans. The most recent Gallup poll reveals that 61% of U.S. adults support the death penalty. Now, death penalty opponents are very quick to note that support for the death penalty is down quite a bit from its high water mark of 80% in 1994. While that may be true, they fail to mention that it is way up from the 42% that it enjoyed in 1966. Moreover, when people are presented with the facts in individual cases, such as those of Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber who killed 168 people and injured more than 800 others, or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the self-professed mastermind behind the 9/11 plot that killed nearly 3,000 people, when people hear about those individual facts, the percentage of support for the death penalty goes higher, much higher. Indeed, according to the same Gallup poll, 40% of Americans do not believe that the death penalty is imposed often enough, compared with only 27% who believe that it is imposed too often. The death penalty also serves three legitimate penological objectives: general deterrence, specific deterrence, and retribution. I'll discuss each of those briefly. The first, general deterrence, is the message that gets sent to people who are thinking about committing heinous crimes that they shouldn't, or else they may end up being sentenced to death. One study out of this university, analyzing data from 1977 to 1996, concluded that each execution resulted in 18 fewer murders. In other words, 18 innocent lives saved. Studies by the University of Colorado, the University of Houston, and other institutions showed similar results. When executions go up, murder rates go down. Of course, these are old studies. In 2012, the National Research Council evaluated every study that had been conducted since 1976 and found that there was no conclusive support for or against the proposition that the death penalty affects homicide rates. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That is hardly a surprising result. It is difficult to measure any general deterrent effect of the death penalty today because of the excessive delays between conviction and execution, and because of how rarely it is carried out. In 1985, the average time between sentencing and execution was 5 years and 1 month. In 2011, it was 16 years and 6 months. As of last July, there were 746 people on death row in California, yet California has executed only 13 people since 1978, and none in the last decade. If an actual punishment is rarely carried out, and that is certainly the case today with respect to the death penalty, the threat of receiving that punishment loses its force. Certainty and timeliness are undoubtedly important factors to consider when evaluating the deterrent effect of any punishment, so I don't take issue with the report's conclusions. Now, I recognize that not every would-be murderer will be deterred by the existence of the death penalty, especially murders committed by those who are intoxicated or mentally disabled, or who commit crimes in the heat of the moment. I would argue, however, that it is highly likely that the death penalty would be more of a deterrent to other kinds of would-be murderers if it was carried out in a more expeditious fashion. Consider this. We all weigh the potential benefits and risks including the potential penalties we may face, of undertaking certain actions. We do it all the time. It strikes me as counterintuitive to think that potential murderers are the only class of people who don't go through this mental calculus, especially since the possibility of death is usually the thing that we fear the most. In fact, we know that some people do engage in this mental calculus. In 2011, Dmitry Smirnov of British Columbia, Canada, shot his former girlfriend several times in the head and body, killing her in a parking lot in Illinois. He had attached a GPS device to her car and had traced her there. In his confession, Smirnov told the police that he decided to commit the murder after doing some research and discovering that Illinois had recently banned the death penalty. That is one murder too many, and one that might not have occurred if Illinois had the death penalty. The second penological objective, specific deterrence, is specific to the defendant. It simply means that somebody who's been executed will not be alive to kill other people. Kenneth Allen MacDuff is an example of this. If MacDuff had been put to death when the death penalty was first imposed, he would not have been alive to kill again, and at least 9 more women, including Colleen Reed, would still be alive. But some argue, what about life without parole? Well, life without parole is, with all due respect, not an answer, because a prisoner who is facing life without parole has no incentive not to kill a guard or a fellow prisoner. Every year, guards and prisoners are assaulted and sometimes killed by inmates serving life without parole sentences. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 356 prisoners were murdered in state correctional institutions from 2001 to 2007. That's almost 60 per year. And an average of about 20 guards are killed every year by prisoners. If you don't believe it, ask the family of Sergeant Reuben Thomas, a 24-year-old guard who had a young daughter and a fiancée. In 2012, Thomas was stabbed in the neck with a shiv, that's a handmade weapon, and was killed by Richard Franklin, who also wounded another guard. Franklin was serving a life sentence for having killed a college student and for shooting a 72-year-old man while stealing his car. Or consider Christopher Scarver. In 1990, Scarver murdered his supervisor at a job training program and almost killed the site manager. He was sentenced to life in prison because Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty. In 1994, Scarver killed fellow inmates Jesse Anderson and infamous serial murderer Jeffrey Dahmer by beating them to death with a metal bar. The third penological goal, retribution, the notion of just desserts, is an expression of society's right to make a moral judgment by imposing a punishment on the wrongdoer that fits the crime he has committed. Now, while some may feel that the death penalty is never justified, most people in this country believe that some unrepentant, cold-blooded, particularly brutal murderers deserve to die for the crimes they have committed and that no other punishment is sufficient. The death penalty does not eliminate our feelings of anger and outrage, but it does enable us to channel and express those feelings in a societally sanctioned mechanism. If people believe that the punishment for certain outrageous crimes is insufficient, that can lead to vigilantism and a breakdown of respect for our criminal justice system. Families often describe having a great sense of relief and finality, knowing that the murderer of their loved one has been fully punished and cannot hurt anyone else or escape responsibility for the heinous crime he or she committed. Of course, the death penalty will not bring back the victim, but it is meant to vindicate the law and to restore the social order as best it can that was undermined by the crime. As Justice Antonin Scalia stated last term in his concurring opinion in Glossop versus Gross, capital punishment presents moral questions that philosophers, theologians, and statesmen have grappled with for millennia. The framers of our Constitution disagreed bitterly on the matter. For that reason, they handled it in the same way they handled many other controversial issues. They left it to the people to decide. Moreover, I think that we as a society need not feel guilty about this enterprise because it is the offender, of his own free will who committed the unspeakable offense. In doing so, he voluntarily assumed the risk that he might suffer the punishment that was imposed. If society has decided that a heinous murderer like Kenneth Allen MacDuff is unworthy of living, I think it can be fairly said of the offender that it is a degradation that was self-inflicted. Thank you.
I believe we got somebody coming in from the back here. Come on, sit, get a seat. If you ever come to an Aquinas Center event late, please come have a seat. You will not offend me or anybody else. Well, I know I've got a good challenge ahead of me. That was a great presentation by John, and I also got a text from my best friend, best man at my wedding. That's what he wrote to me this afternoon. Sorry, but I'm pulling for John Malcolm tonight.
The rarity.
Well, gosh, my best friend thinks that. And that's because reasonable people, as John said, can definitely disagree on this matter. But we come here tonight on a very important matter. At the Aquinas Center of Theology, one of our strategic objectives and goals is to take difficult issues and moral dilemmas and bring them into a discussion or dialogue. We use the Dominican way of disputatio as a common search for truth, right? So that's what we're engaging here today. And this is a tough issue. Life issues, whether it's abortion, death penalty, euthanasia, any of the others, bring out very strong feelings. So, and I understand that. And I have been myself on both sides of this issue. I was once pro-death penalty, and now I'm opposed to death penalty. So I guess I'm arguing with my old self maybe here tonight. But and this is important, too, because there will be an execution, at least scheduled for tomorrow night. I haven't heard whether it's been stayed. I've been out of touch with the news for a couple hours. But Brandon Jones, tomorrow night, who's been on death row since 1979 and is currently 72 years old, will be put, unless there's a stay of execution, will be put to death tomorrow night. So what we're talking about here is not an abstraction, but very real and concrete realities. The polling has been changing. When I first started this desire to talk and research and talk about the death penalty in the mid-1990s, to be against the death penalty was to take your chances, because 80% of the American public was in favor of the death penalty. So that's liberals, moderates, conservatives, your family, your friends, everyone. It was a very hard and lonely task at that point. Today it's 61% in Gallup. Pew poll says 55%. The Washington Post and ABC poll said if you include life without parole and ask people if you had the option of life without parole, would you prefer that or the death penalty? The majority, over 50%, said life without parole. So we have really moved as a country since about 2000 against the death penalty. The number of executions has radically declined from 99 in 1998 to 28 last year. In fact, there were no people sentenced to the death penalty in the state of Georgia last year, which is really quite remarkable. So let's talk a little bit about the process. I'm going to go sort of two parts. One is process, and then talk about the content and rationale for the death penalty. John brought up that we shouldn't have bad representation, but here's what Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg commented in the very case that he was talking about with Justice Scalia. She commented, "People who are well represented at trial do not get the death penalty. I have yet to see a death penalty case among the dozens coming to the Supreme Court on eve of execution stay applications in which the defendant was well represented at trial. They're generally and often represented by the least well-paid attorneys available, right? And that's no knock on the people who do this. God bless them for doing this. But they're overworked. They don't get paid very well. And 1/4 of people who've represented people currently on death row who are attorneys have ended up in their states with disciplinary proceedings before their state bar. So the question is, and we had a long time to think about this, the death penalty was taken away in 1972 and reinstated in 1976. Since 1976, we've had a long time to change this and make it a better system, but we haven't. we're still having these problems. And I think that's one reason why you're seeing fewer sentences and why you're seeing fewer people executed. Also, there's the problem of human error. Yes, John brought up a terrible case, and who among us couldn't hear that and wince and feel badly for the family, feel terribly for the family about those terrible acts? But what about these acts? 156 exonerations since 1973 of people on death row, 6 in 2015 alone. And let me cite somebody on this point, and I would like to bring up this point and make it a central point of my argument that the problem is it's a system run by humans, for humans, and humans are flawed. Humans make mistakes. Systems make mistakes. We're never going to get a perfect death penalty system where innocent people are not going to be executed. We've had a long time to think about this, and yet we have not achieved that. And you may say, oh, that's Phil Thompson. He's with the, at that liberal institution of Emory. No wonder he's saying that. Let me cite another liberal. His name is Richard Viguerie. John knows Richard Viguerie. He's about as conservative a human being as is possible. Here's what Richard Viguerie said about the death penalty. He said, conservatives have every reason to believe the death penalty system is no different from any politicized, costly, inefficient, bureaucratic, government-run operation, which we conservatives know are rife with injustice. But here, the end result is the end of someone's life. In other words, it's a government system that kills people. It's not a liberal. This is a very, very conservative person, arguing, I think, a very conservative principle, which is, if you don't believe the government can deliver your mail, maybe you shouldn't have them delivering the death penalty. Racial inequalities. Once again, John, it was fair to mention that we shouldn't have racial inequalities. The problem is we do have racial inequalities in the system. Your chances of being convicted are highly disproportionate if you're black or Hispanic and you've murdered a white person. A study from Santa Clara Law Review, published in 2005, brings this up. Looking at California, it said a person convicted of the same crime is more than 3 times likely to be sentenced to die simply because the crime was committed in a predominantly white rural community rather than a diverse urban area. Those who kill non-Latino whites are over 3 times more likely to be sentenced to die as those who kill African Americans. And this is part of the question. If you're going to have the death penalty, you don't want it to be disproportionate, arbitrary, right? This is a very profound and important question that needs to be answered if the death penalty is to stand. Cost. I know people tend to think, and I bet if I asked you, you think it's more costly to keep somebody in life without parole or to keep somebody in the death penalty system? And the answer is the death penalty system. You might say, well, that's counterintuitive. And it kind of is. And we can go into all the reasons. But the reason is there's so many requirements in the death penalty system because you're putting somebody to death, right? You're also having to put them in a special location within the jail system, which is more expensive. And they're spending 5, 10, 15, 20 or more years in this system. Of course, it depends. For example, the gentleman who may be killed tomorrow has been in jail for like 37 years. His co-defendant was murdered after 5 years. That seems arbitrary. That seems odd. That seems peculiar that depending upon your facts and your lawyers, you may or may not be killed quickly. And if we are going to keep the death penalty, let's think about, to conclude the process portion, who else has the death penalty in the world? If we keep the death penalty, we're going against almost every country in Europe, most of the countries in North America, South America, Central America. But we will join North Korea and China and Saudi Arabia. These are the countries that still see fit to regularly impose the death penalty. So is there any alternative? John brought up, well, there is life without parole, and I think life without parole is changing the landscape of the death penalty argument. Because once upon a time, and throughout most of Christianity, and I've studied, part of what I have worked on the death penalty is the history of Christianity and the issue of the death penalty, right? And historically, what were the options? You're sitting in medieval Europe. You can exile somebody, you could cut off a hand, or you could kill them. You didn't have prison systems. You didn't have penal systems, right, to take care of this issue. Yes, you should protect people. Yes, you should discipline people. Yes, you should exact a very harsh penalty for these kinds of activities. But the times have changed. And even that staunch liberal St. John Paul II recognized this in the 1990s. Now, if you know anything about the Catholic Church, saying John Paul II is a liberal will make you giggle a little bit. He's hardly known for being a liberal in the church. He's known for being quite a conservative. But what he recognized in his encyclical, Evangelium Vitae, is you have to, following Vatican II, you have to update, right? You have to keep your principles, but you apply them in a different way, in a different context. And he said exactly what I've been talking about, which is it used to be you didn't have any other choice but to kill somebody. Now we have penal systems. It is clear, he says, for these purposes to be achieved, that is, to pursue the appropriate punishment, the nature and extent of the punishment must be carefully evaluated and decided upon, and ought not to go to the extreme of executing the offender except in cases of absolute necessity. In other words, when it might be possible otherwise to defend society. So you're thinking, and out. And then he goes and says this. Today, however, as a result of steady improvements in the organization of the penal system, such cases are very rare, if practically non-existent. In other words, for Europe and the United States, there is no need to do this, right? We need to stop the death penalty. And popes, beginning with John Paul II and Benedict XVI and currently Pope Francis, have all pleaded multiple times in the U.S. to stop the death penalty. Most recently, Pope Francis before Congress. What about deterrence? Now, this is an interesting question, and John was also fair to bring up the National Research Council of the National Academies, which looked at, there's a real paper war that goes on in terms of deterrence, when there were enough cases to actually try to determine it in the 1990s. And you can get your stack on one side and you can get your stack on the other side. But here's 2 points that I would make about deterrence. If it really is a deterrent, why don't we make it more public and more obvious? Why don't we put it on TV? Why don't we hold it in the public square? We used to do that, by the way. People would bring their picnics, and they'd go watch people get hanged. You know, a family activity on a Saturday afternoon. We find that a little abhorrent these days. I don't know a single piece of legislation suggesting we should do that, or that we should televise it, or that we should videotape it and make it public. If it is a deterrent factor, why don't we, and we're not ashamed of this penalty, let's make it public. Let's not do it in the middle of the night with a few witnesses. Let's do it where everybody, including those people we're trying to stop doing these horrible things, let's do it out in the open. Also, as that study that John cited, the National Research Council, one of the fellows, the criminologist Daniel Nagin of Carnegie Mellon said, we also don't know, can any study really determine the mentality of most people who murder? We do have this one case where the fellow researched it. I'd also cite James Q. Wilson, the criminologist, who said the main thing you know about the vast majority of criminals is they're not rational calculators. They don't think long term. That's one of the reasons they're criminals. That's one of the reasons they do the things they do. If they thought it out, they'd probably see it's not a good idea. And Nagin said, nothing is known about how potential murderers actually perceive their risk of punishment. And I would say in the vast majority of the cases, that's true. We don't really know what they're thinking. I don't believe it's a rational calculation for most of them. They're doing kind of an irrational act. What about retribution? Seeking revenge for what has been done. Is something so horrible that we must exact the same thing that was done? And that's certainly the way, in parts of the Old Testament, there is some discussion of that, right? You did this, you get killed. But if we take this literally, do we take rapists and rape them? Do we take people who torture and torture them? We don't. We don't. Even though those things are horrible. Yet we don't say we have to do the exact same thing to them that they did to others, because we're not them. We're better than them. We are better than them in this way. And one of the ways we prove that is by how we respond. Yes, we must put you in a place where you cannot do anybody harm. Yes, you must be punished, perhaps for the rest of your life in a small cell. That's not a fun, should not be, and it is not a fun activity, right? But once we take death into our hands, we're acting like God. This is the theologian coming out of me, right? So I would ask that we be very, very careful about that. We also, with life without parole, we remove the years and sometimes decades of families having to go back through these parole hearings, etc., reliving the horror of the trial and those moments again and again and again. And although it's pretty amazing, there are victims groups, at least 4 that I know of people whose families have been killed and the murderers of their family members are on death row, who are speaking out against the death penalty. Now that's an amazing act of compassion in the face of terrible horror. So in the end, the question is, on the basis of mistakes, on the basis of a bad process, on the basis of we have other alternatives, we can still deter, we have the opportunity to go in a different direction, and that's the way the country is going. And I believe that's the way the country will continue to go. But that's why we're here tonight, to add to that discussion. Thank you.
That's fine. We're going to have a few minutes of a response from John and then from Phil.
Yeah, now Phil's obviously raised a tremendous number of topics for me to respond to, and I couldn't possibly do them all in 5 minutes. I'll say, for instance, 2 of the juicier topics, which is race and the death penalty and exonerations, because I'm confident that they will come up in Q&A. First of all, Phil, having served 10 years in the Department of Justice, I can assure you that there are lots of criminals who are rational calculators. I would also say, by the way, that executing somebody, you have shown full recognition of their human dignity by recognizing that the people who perpetrated these acts were acting as a matter of free will and ignoring the moral responsibilities and moral duties that they had, and they have been accorded all the dignity, I believe, that they are deserving. And with respect to greater forgiveness, I would quote General Norman Schwarzkopf, who led our troops into battle during Operation Desert Storm, who after the 9/11 attacks was asked something about Osama bin Laden, and he said, look, I'm frequently asked about Osama bin Laden and whether we could or should ever forgive Osama bin Laden, and he responded, forgiveness is up to God. Our job is to hurry up the meeting. The death penalty is not imposed by government bureaucrats. It is a very tough personal decision that is made by 12 members of the community, impartial jurors, who are subjected not only to the evidence of the crime, but to all mitigating and aggravating circumstances, including experts on both sides of the equation. This is not an impersonal bureaucratic system. This is not your mailman. Reference was made to other countries. I would add that, first of all, there are many sound democratic countries, such as Thailand, India, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, that still have the death penalty. There are many European countries that have very lax criminal laws that would never fly in this country. So, for instance, in Portugal, the maximum penalty that a juvenile murderer can get is 3 years. And the other thing I would point out about the European countries that have done away with the death penalty is that many of them are far less democratic than we are. And that is because of how their leaders are chosen, usually through a parliamentary system. I would note that when Germany abolished the death penalty enjoyed 77% support in that country. When the UK did it, the death penalty, again, had 70% support. In Canada, over 70% support. The European Union and the Organization of European Cooperation and Development have banned participation in those organizations to any country that has the death penalty. So in other words, you have to choose between free trade, advantageous trade agreements, and advantageous travel arrangements, or retain the death penalty. That is not much of a choice. And I will briefly talk about cost. It is certainly true that the death penalty is more expensive. Capital cases are more expensive. But I would say, one, that there's something cheap about putting a dollar value on the price of justice, particularly if it's your loved one who was killed. I would also note that these studies do not tend to take into account things like the additional plea bargaining costs that are saved by the existence of the death penalty, the end-of-life care for many prisoners, where it's estimated in the last years of your life you're going to get $4 million worth of health care. And I would also note, by the way, that death penalty opponents use cost as a tactic. Catherine Scardino, referred to as the Clarence Darrow of the death penalty in Houston, said at a conference, and I quote, "Spend money, that will get everybody's attention." I can address the other issues during Q&A. I hope to have the opportunity to do so, and with that, let me turn it back over to Phil.
Thank you, John. Just a couple of quick clarifications, because we really want to hear what you have to say, and there'll be microphones for you to be able to ask your questions. So I'm looking forward to that. One difference between death penalty and war, like Osama bin Laden, is the death penalty is the one instance, maybe John will know of another one, but it's the one instance I know of where you take somebody who is no longer a threat to you. In other words, not in self-defense in your home or not fighting somebody in a war. Because even in a war, when somebody gives up their weapon, you don't shoot them. And no matter if they've shot your buddy or not, that is the protocol. But in the death penalty, we say, here's somebody defenseless in a cell, shackled. We're going to take them down the hall. We're going to strap them to a gurney typically now, and we're going to put them to death. That is just a very unnatural human action. I don't know of another instance in which we do that, and it should cause us pause to think about that action. Just to close, and I want to close with a couple of quotes here. This is from former Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, Norman Fletcher, who retired in 2005 and has subsequently come around to be against the death penalty. He said, "There can be no doubt that actually innocent persons have been executed in this country," Justice Fletcher said. He now believes that the death penalty is, quote, "morally indefensible," close quote, and makes no business sense. Also, the 5th District Republican Party Chair, David Burge, is it David? I think it's Burge, but I forgot to write down his first name. But he voiced similar concerns in an op-ed in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about the death penalty. He concluded that capital punishment runs counter to core conservative principles of life, fiscal responsibility, and limited government. The reality is that capital punishment is nothing more than an expensive, wasteful, and risky government program. He says, our government is not perfect, and when you give an imperfect state the power of life and death, innocent lives will inevitably be exposed to the fallibility of the system. And the good news is, if you put somebody in life without parole, if you do find exonerating evidence, that's the one instance you can let them out, right? But once you've killed them, there is no coming back. And with that, I'll stop there, and I think Allison, are we gonna have people come to the microphones? We're gonna we'll hand the microphones to you, but I think we've already got one person set. So Allison and Caitlin if you put your hands up, they will get you the microphone. We'll start with, looks like we already have somebody over here.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say it was excellent presentation. I just wish that this excellent presentation was also done on a number of other issues that relate the same way. As a doctor, I've seen so many people die because of not expanding Medicaid. And the cost in this country is more expensive than any place in the world in reference to health care. And when you see young, innocent people die because their cancer hasn't spread yet and they're not eligible for Medicaid. The second is wars overall. People get medals for killing people. And that goes on all over this world. And why that issue, at Emory we had a humanitarian summit where you brought everybody together who were good people from all religions, all races, all countries. and there are good people in all those instances. So I just wish that you could go a step further, and I wonder whether you would, and address those issues too during some other Aquinas presentations.
Not tonight, but we've got enough on the plate, I think. But certainly you've raised some very important issues, and we're not afraid to tackle some difficult issues like that. So thank you for your comment.
Got a gentleman here?
I have a question for the pro-death penalty discussant. If the just penalty for a calculated murder of an innocent person is the death penalty, then how is justice served in those cases where there was a mistake, as proven by DNA later on?
I'm sorry, when there was no what?
When there similarly was a unjust killing of an innocent person in the death penal system, if the appropriate penalty for someone who does this on the outside is a death penalty, and we have to admit there have been mistakes made within the penal system, when those happen and it's recognized afterwards, what is the just penalty then? Do we execute the prosecutor?
Well, all right. So I thought you were going in one direction, and you're really raising the issue of exoneration. So I'm pleased that you asked that question, and I appreciate it. Look, I think we should, of course, all recognize that it is intrinsically wrong to execute, for that matter, to imprison an innocent person. And we should acknowledge that our criminal justice system is implemented by human beings, and that human beings do make mistakes, and so the risk for a mistake is there. I would add, by the way, that in every human endeavor that we engage in, we put innocent human lives at risk. We do it all the time when we go on our roadways, for instance, and that people decide to engage in all kinds of activities because they think the benefits, moral or material, outweigh the risks. And the same thing could be said with respect to the death penalty. Now let me take on exonerations directly. People who are convicted of the death penalty get numerous, some would say innumerable, rounds of appeals. They get a direct appeal challenging anything that went on during the trial process. They then get to go up to the Supreme Court. They then get another round of state appeals to challenge anything outside of the trial process, ineffective assistance of counsel, newly discovered evidence, DNA evidence, whatever it is you have. They then have federal habeas corpus review, usually numerous rounds of federal habeas corpus review, Supreme Court review, and of course, at the very end of the day, after numerous rounds taking years of time of appeal, any colorable claim of actual innocence can be presented to a governor who can grant clemency. It is true that there have been lots of people. These cases, capital cases, get lots and lots of resources and attention devoted to them, as they should. And that has led to some very, very high-profile exonerations. I would add, by the way, that the risk of error being uncovered is so dramatically higher in a death penalty case than in a non-capital case, precisely because of all of the attention that is devoted to those cases. Justice Fletcher said that there's no question that innocent people have been executed in this country. I would actually take issue with that. There has been no definitive proof, although I recognize that it could have happened. There's been no definitive proof that since 1976, when the death penalty was reinstated, that an innocent person has in fact been executed, although I will acknowledge that there are a couple of cases that at least give me some pause. I would say, however, that even if, that looking at the death penalty system, that it is, by acknowledging that mistakes can occur in the death penalty system, I don't think that that invalidates or renders unjust the death penalty system, any more than I think that it renders our regular criminal justice system invalid or unjust, even though we know for a fact that innocent people are in fact occasionally convicted and incarcerated. We do the best that we can under the circumstances, and when it comes to death penalty cases, as you can tell because the death penalty is so rarely carried out, and there are these exonerations, any colorable claim of actual innocence is investigated to the furthest reaches, man knoweth not to the contrary.
John, I'd like to follow up with a follow-up question on that. My very first deposition, I'm an attorney, was in a death penalty case. The guy had been on death row for 13 years. Emmett Bondurant, who I was a brand new associate for, had agreed to take it on. By the grace of having a new DA in Chatham County, Georgia, he didn't sanitize the file in a murder conviction where the evidence was this thin to begin with. Poor African-American man with a criminal record faced the death penalty, 13 years in prison, and had the same prosecutor been there to turn over the file, there's no reason to believe he wouldn't have sanitized the file to remove the evidence in his file that rebutted the very thin evidence. The Georgia Supreme Court granted the writ. The defendant was released. And the case kept me up at night. I know Phil has done some cases like that, but John, wouldn't it be more rational, since none of us believe that a government employee is incapable of error or bias or even lying? Police perjury, prosecutor perjury, it's not the majority of the time, but it happens. And the case books have many examples. Why don't we set a higher standard, perhaps, of having somebody be convicted twice of murder in two independent acts where you couldn't have one trial to condemn this person to death, because it is a little hard to bring them back to life?
Well, first of all, good for you for doing that work, and I'm glad that justice was served. I do think you are doing, I don't know this prosecutor, obviously. However, if the prosecutor had had a desire to purge the file, my guess is the prosecutor would have purged the file at the time of the trial and certainly before he left his office. So I'm not so sure it's right to denigrate. The prosecutor don't know anything about it, and if a flimsy case was overturned, that is okay. The fact of the matter is that because judges will bend, first of all, because jurors will often bend over backwards if there's a colorable claim of actual innocence, and even all the death penalty opponents will acknowledge that in the overwhelming majority of these cases, guilt is not in doubt. There are a few where that is not the case. Jurors, judges at every level of appeal, if there is a colorable case of actual innocence, or if there is a gross procedural irregularity, will bend over backwards to overturn that conviction, which is precisely why in California, where you have the California appellate courts and the California Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, very, very liberal courts, you have had 13 people executed since 1978, even though there are nearly 800 people on death row. Whenever there is any hint of an actual serious injustice, that case gets scrutinized to the teeth. I'm glad by good lawyers such as you and Emmett Bond are on.
Just if I could follow up quickly on that, I think I saw a study was like, I don't know, 4 or 5%. They estimate that there's probably been a wrongful conviction. So that's low, I mean, in a sense. But for those people,
Unless it's you
It's
being
not a low percentage.
it's being put to jail. Being put to death. By the way, and I just want to ask this because Michael brought about prosecutors and police. Do we have any prosecutors or policemen here tonight? Happy to have you here. Good. That was Michael Sullivan.
I wasn't referring to you. Yeah.
No, of course he was not. I just.
Look, so there are always claims about actual innocence. Time magazine had a guy named, I think it was Timothy Coleman. Is an innocent man about to be executed? Judge stepped in at the last minute, ordered the DNA test that Coleman had wanted, confirmed his guilt. People can present apocryphal stories. They can look at actual exonerations, which are real. Not all of them are real, by the way. Sometimes it's just because evidence has been thrown out, there's not enough evidence to recharge them. But there are plenty of cases of actual exonerations based on actual innocence. And they will take that and they will speculate. But of course innocent people have been killed. And I will acknowledge that during the 50s, 60s, 40s, where procedural due process guarantees were far more lenient, meaning they weren't stringent enough. And you did have racist jurors and racist prosecutors that, the odds of an innocent person actually being executed were higher. The odds of that happening today, I won't say they're impossible, but they are infinitesimally small.
Phil, I want to ask you one quick thing, and I'm going to turn it back over to you guys. But I told one of my partners I was doing this tonight. He said, well, make sure you bring up the case of the Aryan Brotherhood guy I prosecuted who had been ordered to commit murders within prison. And he had life without parole, and he killed another. and he killed another, and he killed another. Or the other prison gang member who chopped off the head of a young social worker who had come in to volunteer in the prison because he had nothing to lose. So isn't it a foolish proposition, I would say, to say that there's nobody out there who deserves a death penalty? Because you can't keep some of these people caged because we have to have people tend to their medical needs. We have to have people feed them during life without parole. I mean, would you draw the line nowhere with somebody who is murdering somebody, staff member after staff member after staff member?
Well, if John Malcolm will concede that one case and accept only that one case for death penalty, maybe we can negotiate a deal. I think the difference is that, you learned in law school, and so did I, hard cases make for bad law. And that's a hard case, right? But when you're making a law, you're making it for an entire system, right? And to make those kind of fine distinctions, I have people argue with me all the time. I had an argument with my brother-in-law. He said, well, if we just knew 99.9999% this was true, then we would do it. And I said, well, there is no human system that operates, and nor is it currently operating at that kind of scientific efficiency. So, yes, keeping people alive without parole, there are problems. But there are also people on death row remain there for 10, 20, it's like they have life without parole. So I'm not sure what the distinction would be necessarily between if he got a death penalty conviction, he might have been in jail for a long period of time and might have been doing those things, unless there's some secret that the death penalty, ward that they need to bring to the life without parole group.
They certainly need to get judges who will expedite the process in order to make that happen. I do hope at some point to address the race issue, so I'm hoping somebody will ask me.
Yeah, we have a question here. We have somebody in the front row here who wants to ask a question next. So.
Good evening, gentlemen. How are y'all doing?
Great. How are you?
Good. I'm good. I'm a theology student here at Emory and have worked before coming here with solicitors. Currently work in the prison system, have worked in other jobs with ex-offenders, and wondering, given a lot of the discussions around here, at least within Emory, and concerning Kelly Gissendanner's execution and...
Sorry, whose execution?
Kelly Gissendanner.
Okay.
I believe you'd be familiar with that. I'm not going to ask about that right now. But I'm just wondering, what comes to mind right now is an article that the AJC, the Atlanta newspaper, wrote with one of the executions that happened a couple months ago, that the pharmaceutical error rate is 50%. And so I'm just wondering, the death penalty, as you said, it's an expensive endeavor. Why can't we just prevent all of this? Why can't we invest more in our school systems, more in, perhaps our welfare systems, other systems that are designed to sort of catch this before we begin to sort of have these mass incarceration sort of issues that we're having right now that do disproportionately incarcerate persons of color, persons with lower education. I'm sure you're familiar with the prison pipeline kind of theory, where your education, if it's below third grade reading level, you're more likely to get to prison. Why are we arguing about this right now and with such vigor? Why can't we sort of divert that to our education systems and prevent a lot of that from getting here right now?
Okay. I'm not going to get into your social policy choices, and I've actually spoken a lot about criminal justice reform and what you refer to as mass incarceration. I'd be happy to be invited back for a future program to talk about that. Look, the death penalty, like all sentences, is about proportionality. We impose minor punishments for minor offenses, traffic offenses, things like that. We impose more strict penalties for more serious offenses, and there are perfectly reasonable people who believe that for certain crimes, multiple murderers, people who have depraved hearts, who have murdered in the past, the Kenneth Allen McDuffs, that there is no other punishment that is fitting, and it accords full dignity, I would argue, to the person who's being condemned, and it also finally accords full dignity to the person whose life was taken. With respect to your other social policy choices, happy to have a beer with you and engage in those debates.
Question back here.
Yes, thanks for coming. In my opinion, it seems like there's an establishment faction that's promoting violence in the pop culture among the population. It's trying to encourage violence and murder. Do you think that's an argument for having less death penalty cases or no death penalty? And could each of the speakers respond to that speculation that the pop culture is encouraging violence?
Go first, Phil.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. No, obviously when you turn on movies, you turn on computer games. I always love it when I talk to people about computer software. They say, well, there's this really thoughtful game, and yes, and it's getting about 0.001% of the people that get games are looking at that. And then, a lot of people are playing Halo. Who here knows what Halo is? All right. All you millennials, I know you know. So, kill this, kill that. And I've played it. It's very addictive and fun. I imagine that some of the people out there are my former partners, senior partners at law firms I worked at. But anyway, that's just me. But the interesting thing is, the question, and this is a difficult question for the research on this, the social science, is it's not, I watched that and I haven't gone out and murdered anybody, nor have I done anything violent. I don't think it would cause me to do that. But for somebody who's already got issues, who may be mentally unstable, then the question is that one more component which is pushing them in a certain direction, right? It's not the whole, we have to be careful about this game caused that thing. I don't believe in that. But we do live in an atmosphere of violence, and there are places in the world that are a lot less violent, like Europe. Yes, they have lower sentences, but they also have much lower murder rates. So the question is, what are they doing in terms of creating a culture of less violence than we are?
I agree with everything that was said. The only thing I would say is that there's evidence that there are people on the margins for whom this does have an impact. You can look at some of the mass murders that have been perpetrated by deeply disturbed people like Adam Lanza, or the Columbine shooting, where it was just obvious that they spent hours every day, days every week, playing violent video games and listening to violent lyrics, seriatim. Now, there are lots of people, of course, who enjoy this form of entertainment. I use the form somewhat loosely from my personal perspective, and nothing, they don't go out and do bad things, but I do think that there are people on the margin for whom this has an impact.
We have a gentleman in the front here in the center.
I have a comment and a question. My comment is, it's difficult for me to see when there is such disparity in the resources that some prisoners have and that other prisoners don't have, that we could have a just system as regards the death penalty and lots of other criminal issues as well. So I would look to the poor who are on death row, and I would look to the poor who have been convicted of other crimes, and I would ask myself, are those people more likely to receive a punishment than those who have a lot of money? And I can cite several cases of people with a lot of money who have been, I think, exonerated, perhaps falsely, from crimes that they have committed because they have a lot of money. My question is this. In the countries and in the states that have abolished the death penalty, has there been a greater degree of murder in those states and in those countries than previously?
It's a fair question. It's somewhat, in this country, somewhat of a mixed bag. So for instance, you have, 31 states still have the death penalty, so it's fairly broad. A lot of the states are, of course, here in the South, where there are somewhat higher murder rates. It's difficult to segment out the existence of the death penalty as having a causal connection. There are socioeconomic differences, there are educational level differences. There's too many things that go into that calculus, I think, to come up with an answer. You can certainly, murder rates are very, very high. I think you can look at sort of rural areas and suburban areas and look at murder rates there. But in terms of states that have the death penalty, it's a little bit more nuanced. That, by the way, is a beginning of a prelude to the answer about race, if I'm ever asked about it.
Gentleman in the middle. officer.
Oh, hi.
So the arguments against, the arguments for the death penalty are roughly two sorts. Deterrence, the death penalty is a deterrent, or the death penalty is justice. Let me start, I want to comment briefly on both of those, but let me first of all say what I believe Mr. Malcolm referred to as individual deterrence.
Specific deterrence, but yes.
Excuse me?
It's fine. Specific deterrence. but
Specific
yes.
deterrence. I would invite you to think of another term, because deterrence is an act whereby by some threat I keep you from doing something. If I kill you, I have not threatened you to keep you from doing something. I killed you and kept you from doing it. So, and nuclear deterrence, for instance, is a total failure if we've got to drop a bomb on the Russians. So deterrence is not the correct term there. You ought to come up with some other term.
It's not my term, by the way. It's a common term taught in law schools, but I hear you.
So let's go to the other, deterrence. When we punish somebody to keep them, to keep other people who are contemplating from doing something. The best research is we can't find any convincing knockdown, drag-out evidence that the death penalty is a deterrent. That's just what we know. We've been thinking about this and writing about this, and as Phil points out, there is no clear evidence that the death penalty is a deterrent. There's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of what if, or if they were like this or were they like that, but we have no really strong evidence.
I wouldn't
so if we
agree
have
with
no
that.
strong evidence...
I wouldn't agree with that. There's conflicting data. That's not the same thing as strong evidence, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think, well, if you were going to take never mind. I disagree, okay?
Do you have a question?
There is no really good evidence to show. So if we don't have any really good evidence that the death penalty is a deterrent, the state should have a good reason for taking your life. And we don't have it in the form of deterrence.
Well,
So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is about justice. The argument for justice is that if you take somebody's life, you deserve to have your life taken in turn. But the problem with that, it seems to me, is that it's not blindingly clear that the only just solution to someone taking another person's life is to take that person's life. It is not clear to me or to a lot of people that life imprisonment doesn't also amount to justice. So once again, if the state is going to take your life, then it ought to have really a very clear reason for doing so. And the argument from justice is not a very clear reason. So for both of those reasons, I think the state should just get out of the business of taking people's lives. Okay. If you lock them up, you can always erase your mistake.
I appreciate your comment. I, of course, disagree with you. I think that the evidence is equivocal as to whether or not there is a general deterrent effect. I'll place my bet on the side that is going to at least potentially result in innocent lives saved. And if that means that some rather heinous murderers get executed without a deterrent effect, then so be it. You can disagree with the term specific deterrence, but the concept is still there. Once somebody has been executed, they can't kill other prisoners, other guards. What if they escape? What if they are the Aryan Brotherhood member who is planning murders from prison? Those people exist. And in terms of a sense of justice, look, I think society is perfectly reasonable to decide that we need to send a message that human life, innocent human life, really matters. And in terms of every murderer being subjected to, lex talionis, an eye for an eye, an eye for an eye, that just doesn't happen. There are lots of murders that happen with intoxicated people, mentally disturbed people, heat of passion murders, felony murders that do not result in the death penalty. The death penalty is reserved for predominantly premeditated murders done in a particularly heinous fashion, often by people who have an extensive history of violent crime. And if society wants to decide that that person deserves to die and that is the only fitting punishment for what it is they've done, you can disagree with it, that's fine, but it's a reasonable choice to make.
Lady over here.
Thank you very much. 2 points. One is a point, and the other is my question. Folks should know that on the direct appeal, which is automatic in Georgia, the Georgia Supreme Court, unlike any other appeal, does a search of the record to see if there is error, which is not true of anything else, then usually it's up to the attorneys to find error to complain about or proposed error. So they actually comb the record to try to see whether there's anything that's amiss. Of course, it's in their eyes, one thing. But my question is this. We've talked about all kinds of different murders and so forth, and the rapes and the horrible cases, but what do we do? Is it, I wouldn't say sufficient, but is life without parole appropriate for treason, for the mass murders that we're having, the mass crimes that we're having, and now with terrorism, which is going to grow and will hurt this country? And is life without parole appropriate for those really hard cases?
Phil, do you want to start on that?
Sure. No, you make great points. Thank you. This, once again, is there are terrible things done, right? When we get to a death penalty case, we're typically, we're talking about some terrible things done. In fact, in Georgia, as you know, there has to be aggravating circumstances. I think there's, 10 or 12 or something, aggravating circumstances that have to exist. What you've seen over the history of the death penalty is we started off very broad. I mean, start with the Bible. You could, if you talk back to your parents, you could get, theoretically, you could get stoned. You could be killed. I mean, we had about 30 different offenses. Now we've narrowed it down to murder, right? And then we've now excluded the insane, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So the question is, it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower naturally over time. The question is there anything left for which we should hold this out no matter what? And there are, and I think we've gone through the different reasons, the different arguments, whether it's cost or deterrence or alternatives like life without parole, et cetera. But let me bring up a theological point. And I'm at the Aquinas Center of Theology, so hopefully you'll grant me the right to bring this up. You don't have to buy this. But I have my friends from Candler here, so maybe they'll back me up. But, nothing is beyond God's grace, right? Anybody who's alive, I don't care who they are. Because if you say that, then you're saying God has some kind of limitation, right? So while a person is alive, they still have that potential. And Kelly Gissendaner, the case that was brought up, she got her certificate in theology from Candler. She had guards come and testify on her behalf. She had a warden come testify on her behalf. That grace and that possibility can exist. And you say, okay, well, that's Kelly Gissendaner, it's not everybody else. Of course not. But just to take it a little bit further, upon your death and upon their death, right? There is a judge who, for eternity, our lives are like this in a year. Imagine 365 days and this. This is our life. 365 days is eternity. There's going to be an ultimate judgment. And to say we have the capability to know with absolute certainty, or almost absolute certainty, that we can make the right choice and that we can put this person to death, and we don't accept the other alternatives, we don't accept that this does something to us as a country to actually in cold blood put a person who's defenseless to death, then that's where the problem is, whomever the person is. And there are hard cases, but there are also hard cases on the side of those who are trying to stop it. The good news is there's still punishment available if we remove the death penalty. The bad news is for the case you're presenting is if you're wrong, and inevitably there will be a certain number of cases that are wrong, you're going to put an innocent person to death, and you're going to remove the possibility of that person to have that experience of conversion and God's grace. And I think that's...
I take umbrage actually at the notion that these people are somehow defenseless, given the acts that they've committed, which have landed them where they are.
No, I'm talking about when they murder them, when they kill them. What kind of defense could they possibly put on death row?
I'm sorry, what kind of...
On death row, what kind of possible defense at that moment do they have?
At that point, they have done what they have done, and in society's eyes have forfeited the right to exist. You can be repentant, genuinely repentant, shortly after you commit the crime, even before you are convicted. Indeed, if you have a date set for your execution, that might have a right, an ability to certainly focus the mind. You can also spend years in death row and not be repentant in any way, shape, or form. Indeed, you could also make an argument that a sign of repentance, a genuine sign of repentance, would be to allow that execution to go forward so that you could help to restore as best you can the moral equilibrium that existed before you commit the crime and to give some closure to the family members. So I think there are many, many ways in which you can express repentance. The other is just about living a little longer.
You may want to work on John's theology with him, but gentleman over here and then the gentleman right across the aisle.
Well, thank God I'm a Catholic and I believe in life from conception to natural death. So, but I'm also an attorney, proud graduate of Prick Me, I'll Bleed Black and Garnet from the University of South Carolina, and now a student with my friends here from Candler, studying theology. But I'm going to ask you a legal question, especially about the standard for reasonability. For those that don't know, like if you go and you run somebody over with your car, you run past the speed light, you know, and that individual sues you in a civil case, you're negligent and you behaved in an unreasonable manner. A criminal standard is higher than negligence. So I really do want this. How can any criminal reasonably engage in calculating whether something is a deterrent? How can, if a person that runs a stoplight is negligent and unreasonable in the eyes of the law, why would we have a criminal standard that says, or make laws that have in mind that a criminal will behave in a reasonable manner by not engaging in behavior that is subject to. Let me make it clearer. I want you to, because I really want this answer. You're saying that a general deterrent, as far as it comes to general deterrence, a reasonable person would not engage in the criminal activity because the punishment is a deterrent. Criminals, by virtue of the law, our current standards, are behaving in ways that are way above, less than reasonable. Because the standard for negligence is reasonability. A reasonable person would do this. So a criminal has to be acting in an unreasonable manner. How is this calculus for reasonability when it comes to deterrence, engaging in behavior that would not be a general deterrent?
I'm not understanding your analogy. So negligence, there are some crimes, they're not facing the death penalty, that involve mere negligence. Indeed, they're strict liability crimes. The difference between a criminal case and a civil case is that a civil case, one, doesn't require in all states a unanimous jury, and two, the prosecution or the civil litigant only has to prove its case by a preponderance of the evidence, while as in criminal case, they've got to convince all 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt. Then you get to the death penalty, where after you have determined guilt or innocence, you have the same jurors coming back in and weighing every conceivable aggravating or mitigating factor, and it is only after that is done before a determination is made about whether to impose
a trial that is lesser, in a civil case, we're saying that someone acted unreasonably.
Yeah.
And in a criminal case, we're saying they acted more than unreasonable. They were criminal. But you're stating that it's a general deterrence to criminal behavior to have a...
You may need to go have a beer with John, too.
Look,
there
are going to be some people...
My point is it just doesn't make sense. They're irrational people. Criminals aren't
There are
rational.
many rational criminals. There are hitmen, there are armed robbers, there are kidnappers who plot out the crimes they are going to commit. We decide when we go to a bar and we're going to drink, are we going to have that extra drink and take a chance in getting into a car because there is the possibility of a penalty if I could get picked up for DUI and spending a night in jail and having my license taken away from me. We decide whether we're going to jaywalk. What's the risk that a police officer is going to stop me? Or if we run a stop sign. We engage in these sorts of calculuses all the time. Now, measuring the general deterrent effect, I will acknowledge, is difficult. Think about it. We know when the deterrent effect doesn't work because somebody commits a murder and there's somebody lying bleeding on the floor in a state that has a death penalty. Clearly, the death penalty did not act as a deterrent. However, we do not know with any great scientific precision just how many people decided not to commit a murder. We know some, like Dmitry Smirnov, But we don't know how many decided not to commit that murder because of something bad happening to them. And even among that subset, we don't know exactly how many of them made that decision precisely because of the existence of a death penalty. I am telling you that for some people, it is clearly a deterrent, and it is impossible for me to imagine that premeditated murderers are the only people on this planet who don't engage in this kind of calculus. And I'll bet that it does, and therefore I will take a gamble on the death penalty actually serving as a general deterrent because I care more about saving innocent lives.
We have time for two more, but I'm going to let Phil respond real quickly, and the gentleman over here is going to go next, and we have time for one more.
Yes, real quickly. So, John, I'm led to believe that a guy is saying, because I'm only going to be put in prison forever, I'm okay with it. I think I'll do it. Whereas if I was killed, not a good choice. It seems to me both of those choices are terrible choices. How is that a rash? Why? Is the gentleman's point, that seems like a very unreasonable way to go to make, well, it's okay if I spend 50 years in a little cell by myself. That's fine. I'll take that risk. But if I'm going to be killed, I'm not going to take that.
Two responses to that. One is there are Dmitry Smirnovs out there that in fact make that calculus. And two, while they are both very, very bad things to have happen to you, for the people who are on death row, they consider the one a lot worse. And the proof of that, because every single one of them on death row is trying to get their sentence converted to life without parole. There is nobody who has life without parole who's trying to get their sentence converted to the death sentence.
But there have been people on death row who try to expedite their getting killed.
Very few.
Gentleman right here.
I'm glad I'm almost the last question because I was trying to get this question out at the very beginning. And I admit that I'm ignorant of the law and I'm ignorant of the Constitution and I'm ignorant of everything, but I just have one really basic question, okay? When I read The Death of Socrates by Plato, Socrates was put to death and they said, run away, and he said, no, because the state has been my mother, the state has always taken care of me, and why would I now break that relationship? John Malcolm, I think, he said that there were references in the Constitution to the death penalty, but I think those were inversions. I mean, to say that you cannot be deprived of life or liberty in the Fifth Amendment is not the same thing as saying that we have the right to kill you. I mean, it may from a legal point of view, but from a practical point of view, the question I'm going to ask is, under what basis, either constitutional, I mean, we all assume that the death penalty is here, and we've been living with it for thousands of years. But in U.S. law, and this is where I'm ignorant of everything, under what basis does the state take upon itself the right or the necessity to execute a member of its citizenry?
Because the issue under the Constitution is left to the states and to the people respectively under the 10th Amendment, and the death penalty is specifically contemplated by several provisions in the Constitution itself. It doesn't mean that the state has to do it. Indeed, 29 states have abolished the death penalty and the District of Columbia, but it means that they're permitted to do it so long as due process is afforded.
I'm sorry, what does the 10th Amendment say exactly?
The 10th Amendment says that all I'll read to you exactly. Well, I won't bother reading it to you. The 10th Amendment says that all powers not specifically delegated to the federal government or prohibited to the states by the Constitution are therefore left to the states and the people respectively.
It is a hotly debated constitutional issue between the Fifth Amendment and whether the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, vitiates that. But we need to go get the beer for that.
Bring the beer in here. We're going to actually have this question and then one more, because you had your hand up for a while, too.
Thank you. Mr. Malcolm, I noted that in your talk you talked about occasional discrimination in the death penalty world, and I have to take issue with that and wonder, have you been looking at the news and have you read some of the more recent books and articles on the criminal justice systems and the fact that it is not an equal thing, and that racism is the issue with the death penalty, and doesn't that give you pause with regard to whether the death penalty should continue?
Thank you for asking me the race question that I've been waiting to ask. I I encourage you to go to Heritage and look up my writings. I write and speak frequently on criminal justice issues in a whole variety of contexts, well beyond that of the death penalty. Look, here's my view about the race and death penalty, very controversial topic. So it is a fact that African Americans are roughly 14% of our population, and they are 42% of the people on death row. So people look at that and go, how can that be? It is also an incredibly unfortunate fact that African Americans are 52.5% of convicted murderers in this country. So to me, the pertinent question is, how come there are so many people, African American people, on death row? To me, the more pertinent question, and there are all sorts of answers for this, we could have a separate debate about that, is why are so many African American people committing murder? There was a Department of Justice study over a 28-year period from 1980 until 2008 that determines that African Americans are 8 times more likely than a white person to commit murder and 6 times more likely to be the victim of murder. 95% of the murders that are committed in this country are intraracial, white on white, black on black. Most intraracial crimes usually involve people where the victim and the perpetrator tend to know each other. They are generally less suitable for the death penalty than interracial crimes. Interracial crimes are usually more suitable because they are often committed in the process of committing another felony, a robbery, a rape, a kidnapping. It is an unfortunate fact that only 7% of black victims in this country are white on black crimes. 16% of interracial murders against white victims are black on white crimes. It is also a fact that most of the people who are subjected to capital sentences, convicted murderers who are African Americans, have more extensive criminal background records than whites who are charged with capital crimes. And there's one other point worth considering, because somebody mentioned before about how when you get into rural areas and things that the death penalty is imposed more often rather than in urban areas where there are black crimes. Well, there's a reason for that, which is the death penalty is often sought by local prosecutors. Local prosecutors are elected officials. Most black on black and white on black crimes take place in urban areas. I mentioned before the Gallup poll that talked about the popularity of the death penalty. Among African Americans, that is the one demographic where the death penalty is overwhelmingly unpopular. It is only supported by 39% of the people. Therefore, district attorneys tend very, very rarely to seek death sentences in urban areas. In rural and suburban areas, however, that are predominantly white, the death penalty enjoys 68% support. So there are a lot more death penalties sought the further you get out from urban areas. Indeed, eliminating the issue of intraracial or interracial crimes, studies of black on black murders have indicated that the death penalty gets sought and imposed far more frequently the further you get away from an urban area and the less black the population is. So I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist, but there are some unfortunate facts in our society that are not race-related that do explain these disparities. And I'm glad I had the opportunity to say that, and I appreciate the question.
Yes, just one quick thing on that. And there is a lot of dispute about this, and it's a highly disputed question. The facts are clearly that, if you're black and you murder a white, there's a lot more blacks who've been convicted and put on death row for murdering whites than the other way around. Now, what is the cause of that? But let me just give you one example. And I used to think that, African Americans complaining about the police, complaining about the justice system, I said that's just, it's people making a living off of doing that, et cetera, until I had a client in a little town in Georgia, and he was charged with robbing a local, I guess it would have been Magic Market back then. And it turned out initially the white clerk at the store, the woman there said, it's a person about 6 feet tall with a slight beard, and my client was like 5'9" with no beard, but then they kept going through a list of potential photographs, including my client's, and kept bringing up his photograph again and again and again until she said, oh yeah, it's him. It turned out that they didn't give him, they wouldn't talk to his family, the police, they wouldn't give him bail. He remained in jail till he went to court, but what happened was another prisoner in another county was overheard talking about how he had done this, and how this poor fool was going to get put in jail. So at the trial, it was finally reversed and justice was served. But that was so illustrative to me about there is a difference. And I think this is why a minority of blacks and Hispanics support the death penalty. They don't believe the system is fair. We disagree on this.
And if you're wealthy, you're not going to get the death penalty in all likelihood, no matter what.
That's probably true, although I will say that with the, no, look, okay, I don't know why that's prompting titters, but that's okay. That's probably true. I mean, look at, O.J. Simpson, perfect example. But, these days when when capital case is announced, almost every state procedure requires the appointment of at least one learned counsel with extensive death penalty experience. And they are often given plenty of money to hire experts and mitigation specialists. So I'm not going to say that injustices don't exist, but this notion that somehow if you're poor and you're black and you're charged in a capital offense, you're going to be represented by some rube who went to Joe's Chili Bar in law school, that's not true.
Last question here, and then we're going to ask you to fill out your assessments, and we're going to have one announcement. Okay.
Hi there. So I hate to beat a dead horse, but I want to add on to the question asked by the gentleman across from me. Okay, so I haven't studied law yet, so maybe you can help me out with this very normative topic of rationality. And this question is geared more towards Phil. In your opening statement, you said something to the tune of that most people convicted of heinous crimes were thinking irrationally or in the short term. Now, I do know there have been studies done on short versus long-term thinking, but regardless, what does the thought process have to do with legal accountability, with the obvious exceptions of mental retardation or being a juvenile? Because in my eyes, these crimes are all irrational, and if you insinuate that you can defend criminals by saying they were thinking in the short term, then could not any criminal argue that they were too?
I'm not sure, I'd be honest, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Okay, so I'm asking what the thought process of a criminal,
right,
whether they're thinking rationally, which is a normative term, or in
right,
the short term or long term, has to do with legal accountability.
Well, I think we were getting into that issue on the issue of whether, if we have the death penalty, that will force some people to not engage in murderous behavior. And so it was a matter of public policy, which would then result in fewer deaths if the death penalty existed and they were rationally calculating it. It's not a matter of whether they're as to their guilt, right?
I'm not talking about being a criminal and deciding whether or not to commit a crime. I'm talking about convicting someone who already committed a crime. Could you justifiably argue that they were thinking in the short term and use that as evidence to...
Oh, okay, I see, yeah. That's not what we were arguing about, but it is a good point. And the answer to that is, if you will be found guilty, if you, it's a little bit like if you're drinking and driving and you run somebody over. Oh, I didn't know what I was doing. The court, I think all of us would agree, is going to say, yeah, you are guilty, whether you were in whatever this mental state you were in, because you took the alcohol which put you into that state. So if you guilty, certainly, you will be found guilty. Now, mens rea, your criminal intent, is something the court takes into account. For example, premeditation, right, will up the level of what you will receive. You don't get off of something just because you didn't think it through rationally, or you were in a rational mode when you did it, right? But if you were incapable of rational thought, it might mitigate the fact that your crime was premeditated. It also might indicate, if you can prove you were so irrational as to be insane, which is a very hard defense to prove, but if you can prove that, they may put you in a mental health hospital, right, rather than put you immediately into jail or something. Similarly, if you're too young and your reasoning capacity hasn't fully formed, you will still be given a sentence, but you won't be treated like an adult whose mens rea, whose mental state has fully gelled. Does that make sense?
I have nothing to add to that.
Okay.
All right. Thanks very much. It was a lot of fun to be with you. It was fun.